Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people. A regular podcast on radical, environmental and anti-capitalist politics. Brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. Back after a brief hiatus, I am Scott Parkin, your co-host in Berkeley, California. And as always, I am joined by the next Speaker of the House, my co-host.
You weren't supposed to say it. That could break my momentum now that it's gone public. But that's Bob Bazanko in Easton, Texas. And welcome back, Scott. And I've been working behind the scenes. I've been trying to get Trump's endorsement. I've already got Madge Taylor Greene and Boebert and Gates. So if I could get Trump, I think I'd have a shot at it. So.
Yeah, I'm still holding out to see when Costner gives you his endorsement. This, folks, is why we've been on hiatus, because Bob's been strategizing with Steve Bannon on his next move.
And similarly, I thought you were going to be the next Senate appointee in California, but we'll have more to say about that. But you must have pissed off Gavin Newsom.
That time I accidentally bumped one of his staff members in the head with a protest sign. There's that. So, folks, we're back. We're going to be doing a Scrappy Sunday here for you. It's our version of the Sunday morning talk shows, but we're much scrappier and much more interesting, better looking, and funnier than anybody you'll see on any of those Sunday morning talk shows. And to kick it off, we're going to talk a little bit about this week in history, maybe a little bit further back from this week in history. I'm going to just throw them out just a little bit all over the place. But the first one that I want to mention happened on October 1st in 1962, when James Meredith became the first Black student to enroll at the University of Mississippi. Violence and riots surrounding the incident led to President Kennedy, who we'll be talking about a lot in the near future, sending 5,000 troops to the University of Mississippi to quell the unrest. And then the other two This Week in Histories that I want to mention both happened on October 5th. The first one happened in 1945. There had been a 6-month strike by the set decorators at the Hollywood studios. On October 5th, there was a bloody riot actually at the gates of Warner Brothers Studios in Burbank when scabs actually tried to cross the picket line. The incident is known as Hollywood Black Friday. And then also on October 5th, about 30 years later, the U.S. auto workers, who were organized by the United Auto Workers, who are on strike right now for, I think, on 2 weeks at this point, won a 3-week strike against Ford for more vacation days, better retirement, and unemployment benefits. And then the last one I'm going to mention is actually a little bit out of the chronological one, but I wanted to say it last, which was on September 28th, 1917. U.S. federal agents arrested 165 Wobblies, members of the IWW, for their opposition to World War I. Part of their real crime had been engaging in strikes and slowdowns, but I often have been thinking about the Wobblies' opposition to World War I when I think about some of the money in which the U.S. government has been putting into particularly the war in Ukraine, but also the sort of beefing up the military in East Asia around Taiwan and the conflict with the People's Republic of China. And I just want to note that this week in Washington, D.C., our comrades with Code Pink actually went and did a sit-in in Bernie Sanders' office, U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, that is, who is also a self-proclaimed democratic socialist, who has actually spoken out for many decades about his opposition to big Pentagon budgets and wars. And I believe actually even at the beginning of the Ukraine war, he had actually said that he opposed money going into Ukraine, but now he's shifted his position. I guess you could say he did a flip-flop. He might be a little bit like what we would call a Clinton and did a flip-flop, and has been actually supporting big budgets going into the Ukraine war. And so 11 activists with Code Pink were actually arrested in Bernie's office a couple of days ago in protest of the war in Ukraine, and him supporting funding of the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, this is the guy Jacobin has been telling us for years, who is the kind of modern day G-Debs. G-Debs got a 10-year sentence for opposing World War I, and Sanders is not just snitching, but getting peace activists arrested. So once again, I think it tells you a lot about that establishment left, that New York left that is so influential.
Yeah, it's a very important thing to note. And many other members of, not all of them, but many members of the squad actually also support funding that goes into the war in Ukraine as well.
Yeah, it's creepy, isn't it? Along those lines, liberals were so excited last week because there was a picture of Marjorie Taylor Greene with Code Pink people opposing the war, and she photobombed them. Code Pink doesn't like Marjorie Taylor Greene, but it was just ironic to see how upset, not ironic, it was predictable but ironic, how upset these liberals were at saying, basically smearing Code Pink. See, we told you Code Pink was crazy. They're talking about Marjorie Taylor Greene, when in fact she photobombed them. But it ignores the bigger issue, which is that the anti-war strength in the political system is actually coming from the crazy right wing people like Gates. And I don't think it's like a principled anti-war position or a pacifist position. I think it's just because of Trump. If the Democrats are for it, they're against it, and Trump and Russia. But at the same time, they're right. But I like it. Liberals would never want to say that.
It's performative in that they're only doing it because it's what Biden and the Clintons and Obama and Blinken and all those people support.
Yeah. But at the same time, to call out, to get activists arrested, or to attack Code Pink because Marjorie Taylor Greene photobombed them while they were opposing the war is really, quite frankly, it's chicken shit. This is where we are. This is where we are.
Not very surprising, though.
No. Did you have another one? Or I just have a couple brief ones that are foreign policy related, and I think they're important in the contemporary context too. On October 6th, 1973, so it's 50 years, the Yom Kippur War broke out. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israel had conquered territory in Palestine, like Gaza and the West Bank of the Sinai. In 1973, a coalition of Arab states attacked Israel, trying to gain that land back. After some really impressive initial successes, Israel reversed with significant input from the United States, heavy shipments of arms and armor. The U.S. actually even put its nuclear forces on the highest alert, which had only happened, I think, twice in the Cold War era. I'm just going to talk about the other one next. And Israel reversed the Arab offensive and ended up establishing itself in those territories and gaining more. I think much of the battle took place in the Sinai. So as a result of that, Israel now occupied areas it still occupies today, with the exception of the Sinai. And the UN, after the Yom Kippur War, in Resolution 338, said Israel had to leave. Resolution 338 has never been abided by, and that followed 242 in 1967, where the UN did the same. No country has violated or ignored UN resolutions more than Israel. And of course, we know what the long-term impact of Yom Kippur and the Six-Day War and all those other events was. The CIA has been basically on fire ever since, even with Camp David and the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords especially really, as Edward Said at the time pointed out, were not an agreement that really helped the Palestinians at all. And in today's context, as we look at the Middle East, and Biden is cozying up to Saudi, and obviously Israel is just on an absolute pogrom against Palestine. A lot of that can go back to this period. And in 1967 and 1973 is when the United States really threw all in with Israel. There'd always been this kind of relationship. But in the earlier years, the U.S. wanted to try to maintain some idea of keeping communications open and not coming down too hard against the Palestinians and the Arab states for oil reasons, as well as anything else. But by 1973, the U.S. clearly was using Israel as the cop on the beat, or the gendarme, or however you want to say it, in the region. And so it's important to understand that's been 50 years now, and the U.S. has been on this kind of consistent path toward supporting whatever Israel did, and it just gets more and more desolate. And the humanitarian crisis there is just amazing, and the media doesn't do a whole lot with it, worth noting. And then the other time that nuclear forces were on the highest alert was in October of 1962. And this is something we have talked about at length. I think it's one of the best shows we've ever done. In mid-October, the United States, American U-2 pilots took photographic images of bomb installations in Cuba, and that gave birth to what we would come to know as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Missiles of October, which starts around mid-October. It goes toward the very end of the month. We have done a great show on that, which we'll put back up again, and I would encourage you.
And we'll drop it in the show notes too.
Yeah, I think it's like as good as anything out there because, and this is something we talk about a lot. We're on the Kennedy bandwagon, except the Kennedy was not a dove bandwagon. Kennedy was a hawk bandwagon. And so I think the Cuban Missile Crisis, because a lot of the people in that Kennedy camp, and these people are more powerful than ever. The RFK campaign, Jeffrey Sachs has a new book about what a great guy Kennedy was and how he was going to bring peace to the world. And then even Chris Hedges, somebody who I generally respect quite a bit, has joined onto this, and it's just that not to his credit. And a lot of really people who I respect otherwise are just absolutely bonkers on the JFK stuff. And so I think looking at the missile crisis, Kennedy brought the world to the brink of a nuclear exchange through his brinksmanship, through his recklessness. And if anybody stopped that conflict, it was Khrushchev, and actually even more than that, the Soviet submarine captains, right? And that was 61 years ago. Last year we did a 60th anniversary show on it in October, and I would suggest it's a really good, all the stuff we've done is a really good antidote. And this is the 60th anniversary of Kennedy's assassination, so you're going to hear more and more of this in the next couple months, and we'll chime in on it as well. But quite frankly, I don't think anybody really cares what we have to say, because you're up against this myth, this potent, heroic JFK, who, without any evidence, they've created into this peacemaker, this dog. But I would suggest looking into as a start, to look at the Cuban Missile Crisis as a real reflection of what he actually did and what he actually believed in, and that occurred started in mid-October of 1962. And something that to keep in mind, along with the Yom Kippur War, in terms of America's role abroad, because Cuba and Israel are still there today. That's still big deals today.
Yeah, and I think like an important thing here to remember is, particularly in today's political context, liberals in particular, but like left liberals, progressives, and even Sanders supporters are all very much in this camp is that all of the bad foreign policy comes from the Republicans, and they often point to the wars of 20 years ago, where Bush invaded Afghanistan, and it was a 20-year occupation which Biden ended, and Bush pushed the war in Iraq, and the Democrats were hapless in his unmerciful push to war to invade Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which actually a lot of these Democrats, actually, like Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton, actually voted to support that war. And so this foreign policy is a bipartisan endeavor. And so when we see, in today's foreign policy world, when we see aid go to Israel, when we see aid go to Saudi Arabia, when we see aid go to the Ukraine, it's a bipartisan endeavor, no doubt about it. There's no partisanship going on there at all. And I actually want to segue into
actually, you just made me think of something there. So
I'll hold the segue. Put pause on the segue.
Yeah. No, because if you look at Israel, like in 1967, it's LBJ who makes this massive commitment to Israel. And in 1973, it's Nixon and Kissinger. And that just reminded me of one of my favorite vignettes. In 1976, during the presidential debates, I forget what the lead-in was, but Jimmy Carter was talking about the Cold War in the Soviet Union. And Gerald Ford then said, I don't think it's fair to say that Poland is dominated by the Soviet Union. And he caught hell for that. And then in the vice presidential debates, Bob Dole essentially said to Walter Mondale that the wars of the 20th century were democratic wars, which is basically true, right? And that, of course, you can see my thought process going here, which brings me to Jimmy Carter, who's also been in the news because he just had his 99th birthday. He went into hospice like 6 months ago, and he's still, living. He's still apparently alert, and talking to people and following the news. And as we've said many times, no one has a post-presidential career like Jimmy Carter. He's genuinely decent, human, great guy, believes in peace and public health and civil rights and election integrity. But this is another blurb for one of the shows we've done. But as president, Jimmy Carter was a typical American president. He was an imperialist. He was a war criminal. He took care of the ruling class. And we'll also put that in the show notes. But it's just that idea that Trump is to blame for everything, or Reagan or Bush or whoever, who are all reprehensible people. But when it comes to things like that, it really is bipartisan. Look at Honduras, look at Libya. Those were democratic joints. Yeah, you're not going to find that you're really a humanitarian. When the socialist in the Senate is getting peace activists arrested, you really don't have anything to stand on. You really can't start attacking the Republican Party for being a bunch of war criminals and thugs, when in fact your people are as well.
Yeah, 100%. And it's one thing that's really been lost on me with many people who are involved in politics, particularly around U.S. empire and interventions abroad and things like that, about how to them it's such a partisan endeavor, when the reality is that the institution of U.S. foreign policy is bipartisan in nature. The institution of empire is bipartisan.
Yeah, Biden is now going to resume construction of the wall, remove all the permissions processes for wetlands, and land and everything else. So yeah, you buy one, you get one free. I think there's no doubt Trump is clearly more dangerous. Just he's sociopath, right? He will put people in jail and he will shutter institutions and God knows what. But
You know,
in
he
terms of
incites paramilitary violence, or
yeah, incites yeah, all that. He unleashed the crazies, right? Absolutely.
Yeah.
But in terms of the actual policies, Biden, he's met some Martha anyway, and it's not as significant. In fact, I was telling you that the new polling shows that Americans overwhelmingly think that the Republicans are better on issues like the economy and inflation and immigration and security and all that kind of stuff. And that reflects, we could talk about that a lot, but the reality is that also reflects the almost total absence of any kind of alternative story or resistance to them. So it's really is a bipartisan world. Yeah.
Yeah. The thing that I want
now you can segue.
Now I want to segue to another actually thug who has a narrative that makes them look a lot better than they actually are, which is Dianne Feinstein. And to talk about Dianne Feinstein a little bit, I'm not going to talk about how great she was. I'm not going to talk about what a feminist icon she was or whatever that is. I'm going to actually start off with the background of her marriage and how her and her husband, Richard Blum, who actually died last year, where Dianne Feinstein died last week, how they actually were able to milk the country of a whole lot of money and a whole lot of natural resources and support things like the structural adjustment programs with the IMF and the World Bank, and support endeavors in Iraq and all of that sort of stuff. Just a little background. Richard Blum was a San Francisco-based finance capitalist who presided over an expansive business empire. It included hedge funds. He was actually one of the wealthiest hedge fund managers in San Francisco during his time. He had a real estate empire where the primary investment vehicle was Blum Capital Partners, and owned some of the largest real estate brokerage. It owned the largest real estate brokerage firm on the planet, which was called CB Richard Ellis. And Blum, of course, was the chair of the board at his peak. He owned construction, which he actually was able to get lots of government contracts through legislation that his wife actually had sponsored and proposed. And he was a major partner in some of these construction and engineering companies that did billions in business with the US military and other clients. Education, he was actually the alpha regent of the largest public university system in the world, which is the University of California. I didn't even know alpha regent was an actual official title that you could have. Maybe you'll be the alpha regent of the University of Texas system someday, Bob. That's what I'm banking on.
I'm also talking to Abbott. If the Speaker of the House thing doesn't work out, I can be the alpha regent.
You can become the alpha regent of the University of Texas system. But while he was the resident alpha regent of the University of California, he was also the primary owner of the second largest for-profit education firm in the country, which was called Career Education Cooperation. He owned land holding firms. He had a health industry corporation, which actually worked to undermine the expansion of public health care. He even owned a border town, Maquiladora, that built weapon components for the Department of Defense. I
didn't know that.
yeah, he was a real good guy. It's interesting if you look at pictures.
So he's the Democrats' Eric Prince. Yeah, like the Blackwater of the Democrats,
basically, or Sheldon Adelson, or any of those people. But Blum's greatest, and actually, I just want to say that if you look at pictures of Blum and Feinstein from the era where they first got together when she was mayor of San Francisco, he has a hippie look about him. He has a sort of like hippie San Francisco look for someone who made a lot of money and was doing a lot of behind the scenes deals. Blum's, however, greatest career investment was his marriage for 30 years, 40 years to U.S. Senate Democrat Dianne Feinstein, which actually meshed his financial interests with her formidable political ambitions. He actually had been a big backer of her when she was mayor, and then they got married. Some of his primary means of political enrichment were to rely on nation-state interventions in markets and societies to promote unfettered corporate dominance of national economies in distant lands. And so Feinstein and Blum actually did a lot to push corporate globalization and austerity and privatization in other parts of the world. Leading proponents of the International Monetary Fund World Bank, also being in a sort of nexus with the US Treasury. And Bob and I actually first started out together doing anti-corporate globalization organizing, where we were actually educating people and organizing against structural adjustment programs. And so it was Blum and Feinstein who were some of the leading proponents of that. And they made a lot of money. So a lot of these investment corporations, a lot of these companies that privatize education systems or go around and build bases and dams and things like that, that was all under Blum's financial empire. And so just, clearly there's a lot of investors and businessmen who did this sort of thing, but I just want to note that this one was married to the California senator for 30 years. So he had a whole different level of access. And then the other thing I really wanted to talk about with Blum is actually his relationship with this guy named Charles Hurwitz. Charles Hurwitz owned an investment company. He was a very well-known corporate raider in the 80s and 90s. His company was called Maxam. I actually was part of a campaign in the early 2000s against Maxam in Houston because that's where they were actually based. But one of the things that Maxam would do is they would go and buy companies, and then they would liquidate all of the resources to the fullest extent, and then they would sell off the scraps. And what Hurwitz did in Northern California is he bought a company called Pacific Lumber, which actually had been logging old growth forest in Northern California, the redwoods. And Hurwitz actually upped the level of liquidation of the redwoods and basically cut a lot of them down in Northern California. There was actually a pretty fierce campaign against Hurwitz and Maxam and Pacific Lumber in the late 80s and early 90s, waged by North Coast Earth First, most notably by Judy Berry, who's a sort of inspirational organizer who actually died in 1997. Judy Berry had actually been bombed, but Hurwitz and Judy Berry and the Earth First movement, actually, there was an epic struggle there. Some of the largest direct action protests, particularly around environment in history. It so happens that Hurwitz was also an investment partner of Richard Blum from way back. Blum was also a major donor and fundraiser and political booster of US President Clinton. And so there was this point where the direct action campaign brought the liquidation of the redwood forest to such a crisis that Clinton had to intervene. And his intervention was that he created a legislative team to negotiate the purchase of the headwaters, which is actually the area that was being logged from Hurwitz. And who do you think he appointed to be head of that legislative team that negotiated the deal? Any guesses?
Initials are RB?
No, DF. Dianne Feinstein.
Oh,
was made the chaired the legislative team to negotiate the purchase of headwaters from Hurwitz. And so basically who's in business with her husband. Yeah, exactly. So I just want to be clear that Maxam had actually clear cut most of the forest in question and headwaters that was being negotiated for, but he was still able to get a deal for $380 million of taxpayer funded money. More than 4 times the market share of the trees at the time, the trees of which had already been cut down. Yeah. And the government actually didn't do its job in the Bush and Clinton years around headwaters, which was to just enforce the Endangered Species Act, which would have actually saved the redwoods and a whole lot of critters in the forest. Afterwards, headwaters actually became officially protected, but everything had been devastated by Maxam and Pacific Lumber. And then I believe he actually I guess Pacific Lumber is still in business, but there were points where I thought he had actually run it into bankruptcy because that was his MO. He's also really known for doing that with Kaiser Aluminum, I believe, where he actually liquidated the steel workers' pensions after he'd run that company into the ground. And so Blum, Hurwitz, Feinstein are all like in bed together. Also seems like the Clintons are too. We also know that Blum did things like, there was actually a piece of legislation that Feinstein co-authored in 2009, which was like a bailout for people who were losing their home, their foreclosures. And about 2 months before that bill was sponsored and passed, Blum had actually secured contracts to be the one to help the people who were being foreclosed upon get their homes back, or help negotiate the sort of loss of those homes on foreclosure. And she basically negotiated like a piece of legislation that profited her husband's company.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You go ahead. I feel like I'm going on a lot here.
No, I was just going to kind of, in the broader sense, I think Feinstein is really a great case study in kind of contemporary late 20th, early 21st century liberalism in America. She's obviously very well connected to these like really high level cutting edge capitalists, these bankers, these investors. Always was an advocate for an interventionist foreign policy, obviously supported American militarism, American Pentagon budgets in Israel very strongly. I'm seeing a lot, and this is similar to what happened when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and I'm sure I'll offend somebody here. But in both of these cases, we saw the narrative became like these were trailblazers for women, which is great, obviously. There's nothing wrong with that. But there are a lot of trailblazers for women after. Judy Barry, you mentioned earlier, right? Why not her, right? Yeah. But people like Ginsburg and Feinstein really did represent this kind of old boy network or old girl network, whatever you want to call it, disestablishment network. And Feinstein became mayor under bizarre circumstances when the mayor was murdered.
Angela Moscone.
Yeah, and with Harvey Milk, and so she was the head of the board of supervisors, I believe, at the time, and they appointed her mayor. And she was on good terms with the developers, so the kind of gentrification and many of the horrors in San Francisco today really can be traced back to that period, like 45, 50 years ago. At one point, she flew a Confederate flag in front of the mayor's building, in the city building. And now we're not talking about Biloxi, Mississippi, or Alabama, or Houston, or whatever. We're talking about Sanford, like the epitome of American liberalism, and they have a Confederate flag flying. I think an African-American activist ran up there and took it down, and they arrested him. And so
more than once, multiple times, and he would go up and take it down, and then they would put it back up.
And it's a flag, but I think the symbolism of it is really important. Feinstein, which goes into what connects with what you mentioned, has been, it's been clear she's been using her knowledge or insider knowledge to trade. So there's a significant history of insider trading there. She's opposed, just like Pelosi and others have opposed anything, because Pelosi's done quite a bit of that. And I'm sure everybody in Biden, everybody else has too, right? So they've been opposed to anything that would limit their ability to use this inside information in the stock market. And from a personal standpoint, one thing I remember about her, which I don't think made any news at the time, and actually I tried to look it up, there was no indication of it, but I remember very well. As a history professor right now, these are fairly difficult times because you have various states going through these attacks on like critical race theory and banning books. And this started, what did Trump call it, the 1776 project after the 1619 project and all that. This is not new. In the 80s and 90s, we had we refer to them as the history wars. People who teach history or historians. And there was I think the NEH came out with a new set of history standards, and the historians came out with a new set of history standards. The NEH, which was led at the time by the mother of who is today liberals' favorite Republican, Lynn Cheney, was very upset at that. And so Lynn Cheney began this public attack on these new history standards because they reflected the idea that historians need to talk more about the real history of America, which would include slavery and women's struggles and labor struggles and all that kind of stuff that you and I have grown up studying. And Dianne Feinstein spoke up, and Feinstein said that she basically agreed with Cheney and wished that, the quote, I don't know if it's exact, but she said, I wish history could be taught the way it was when I was in school. We just learned the facts, right? Dianne Feinstein graduated with a degree in history from Stanford in 1955. And, Stanford in 1955 was one of the headquarters of the old consensus history, a very conservative history, which kind of proclaimed that America, yeah, sure, it had blemishes and it made mistakes, but it always rallied. It got together. We're a unified country. You overcame it. We had slavery, but then we had the Civil War. Look at how great things turned out. And so Feinstein, I think that's always stuck in the back of my head, that what we're seeing today, and again, liberals are always saying, oh, it's Trump, and it is. Babbitt and DeSantis are terrifying, right? But there was a lot of bipartisanship in this, and I do remember Feinstein's role at the time just like really was repulsive, taking the side of these people who essentially wanted to whitewash, literally whitewash in a lot of ways, the way we are taught history. And this battle has been ongoing for decades now. So what we're seeing today isn't like something new, right? It's the product of this long-term thing. And I know liberals love Liz Cheney now because she stood up to Trump, but she represents that same thing as Feinstein, as a lot of these people do. Feinstein also stayed on way too long. She was ineffective. She clearly had lost her capacities, her mental capacities. Like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I think that's legit. I know I can't tell you how many times people have attacked anybody, including me, who said Ruth Bader Ginsburg should have resigned when she was first diagnosed. But the reality is there are political considerations there. And Feinstein just always struck me as really one of the more kind of odious, frankly, Democratic senators, and there are plenty of them, right? But maybe she's not as bad as Manchin or Sinema, but that's the floor, right? But she's not in no way a progressive either. No.
I do feel like her, if she's not as bad as Manchin or Sinema, just like reading this article where I got a lot of this information is from Will Parrish and Darwin Bond, who wrote it probably about 10 years ago in Counterpunch. And it's just the amount of money in which Blum and Feinstein milked from taxpayers, the way in which they ripped off poor people, the way in which they hurt poor people in other parts of the world. I guess it was a little bit more under the radar, but it still is. I almost feel like it's worse. I'm sure actually Manchin's been in the Senate long enough where he's probably done a lot of this too. But just to me, it feels even worse just because we don't know about it and they've been able to paint themselves in this sort of liberal do-gooder image.
Yeah.
That's the same with Ginsburg, same with Hillary Clinton, same with many others. Like that's what in a critique of American liberalism is to me it's just so bad about how they act like they're cultural McGovernicks or whatever. And those were the images I was referring to of Blum and Feinstein from the late 70s and early 80s, is that they look like Bill and Hillary did when they worked on the McGovern campaign in 72. But in reality, they're working for Wall Street West and the Pentagon and whoever else.
Yeah, and I think this is also where the Republican attack on the coastal elites really gained steam as well. Yeah. And it's true, it really is. I mean, when you think about these California Democrats, the Republicans portray as basically as Marxist or the radical left, when in reality, they're very corporate centered. They have significant investments, and that goes, that's obviously Feinstein, I think Pelosi. I always had the sense Barbara Boxer was a little different, a little better than that. Yeah. I don't really know her background, but I'm sure. And even today, Gavin Newsom, who was,
Pelosi. Did we say Pelosi?
Yeah, I said Pelosi.
Yeah.
Pelosi and her husband both, right? Very wealthy. Pelosi's father was the mayor of Baltimore. She comes from really long, old Democratic family, Democratic machine. And even today, Gavin Newsom, who a lot of liberals fantasize about running for president, recently vetoed a bill which would have provided unemployment comp to striking workers, which is just a fundamental idea that Newsom, a really chicken shit, actually veto of it. Didn't really explain anything to it. Just said, we're all in this together and we got to work for a solution. Kind of bullshit. So
the senator in which he appointed to replace Dianne Feinstein was a senior advisor to Airbnb. Yeah. Actually, they actually talk about how she is like a labor leader, but she was actually a paid consultant by Uber to make sure that Uber drivers were not actually considered like full employees. They were always just going to be contractors, which leads to less pay, less benefits, et cetera, under California law.
And she's also the director of Emily's List, which is a political action committee for basically liberal women to get tons of corporate money to run for office. If I think of Feinstein, I don't know if she actually became the longest serving woman in the Senate or she barely missed out, but the other one would be Barbara Mikulski from Maryland. And Mikulski had plenty of flaws as well, but Mikulski actually is, I think, a more legit kind of political figure than Feinstein in terms of her kind of progressive credentials, although neither of them are going to be mistaken for Emma Goldman or anybody like that, the rebel girl.
It's like mistaking Bernie Sanders for Eugene Debs.
Oh, boy. Yeah.
Oy vey.
Oh, I tell you, I need some soup now. These activists came in, they ruined my day.
The last thing, because I didn't hit this one, the last thing I want to say about Feinstein is that she was the chairperson of military construction appropriations, like after the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq start, and she appropriated more than $1.5 billion to two defense contractors, URS Corporation and Perini Corporation, both of which her husband. We complained a lot 20 years ago about Cheney and Halliburton and George Shultz and Bechtel and all of that sort of stuff. No one talked about Feinstein and Blum, who were just as bad.
Yeah. I know, and I really think when the Republican Party talks about coastal elites, and it has been doing that for many years now, I often thought of Pelosi, Feinstein, obviously Feinstein and Pelosi, the New York people like Hakeem Jeffries, Schumer, And this, in many ways, has always been a gift to the Republican Party to have these people kiss their caricatures. They're incredibly wealthy. They're getting wealthy off of insider trading, off their connections, like you just mentioned. And despite some lip service, they don't give a rat's ass about actual working people. Look at Hillary today. What did she say? They all need to be deprogrammed or something like that. People who voted for Trump need to be deprogrammed. Now, there's a lot of crazy people voting for Trump, and I don't get it, right? The guy's nuts, and the QAnon stuff is insane. But is it really a great idea to go around insulting people? Like when she called them deplorables in 2016, because there are some people there who might be open to a different idea if you actually approach them and said, hey, we want to make your life better. We want to give you health insurance. We want to help you organize a union. We want to get you better wages. We want to cancel your student debt. We want to legalize weed, whatever, right? Mm-hmm. You might be able to reach them. But when you go in there and say, you're a bunch of deplorables and you need to be reprogrammed or whatever the hell it was, you and I could say there's a cult out there. Nobody gives a shit what we say. Nobody cares. It's Hillary Clinton, who's like Ginsburg and Feinstein, who's really heroic, especially among Democratic women. Yeah. And I think we really need to be careful about that and really should spend a little more time thinking about the kinds of people we put on these pedestals. Not you and I just mean people who would consider themselves more open-minded and more progressive or whatever.
We put other people on pedestals.
I put you on a pedestal, Scott.
I put you on. That's why I'm supporting your bid to become the next Speaker of the House, Bob. Speaker of the House, the Honorable Speaker of the House, Robert Bazenko.
People were saying Trump could be Speaker of the House. I think I have a better chance than Trump becoming Speaker of the House. It's funny.
That's all we need.
Isn't that funny? The liberals got Trump's never going to be Speaker of the House. It's just not. You think it's bad now? I think Republicans know that. It'd be in a way, it'd be great because nothing would get done, right? That's the only beauty behind it. But yeah, but Dianne Feinstein really, I think, in so many ways represented the worst of American politics. And I think the people running, Katie Porter and Barbara Lee, have some progressive credentials on, especially on economic issues. So that's
Barbara Lee does on matters of war and military.
Yeah, you're going to see an improvement there. But Feinstein's legacy, on the fact that you heroicize her, and that's one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot in the last few years because we're in a, I think, fairly bleak situation. And lefties love history, right? That's what I wanted my whole life. I wanted lefties to love history, but I'm not sure it's really worked out the way I thought it would. It tends to become a heroic history, a romantic history, where they put certain individuals on pedestals, whether it be Ruth Bader Ginsburg or Dianne Feinstein. The worst of all, of course, is JFK, right? And so the left is going around trying to find these people, these magical individuals who somehow made a difference. And
the unicorn, it's their the liberal unicorns.
And so the study of history, learning the wrong history or learning history badly is, I think, worse than just not caring about it at all. And we're definitely seeing that. And I think we always take pot shots at Jacobin, though not nearly as many as they deserve. But the way they created the Bernie Sanders persona, I think is just as reprehensible from the very beginning. Sanders is a decent human. He's done some really good stuff. On the American political system, he's as good as you're going to get. Seems like a decent guy. But to utter his name in the same context as Gene Debs was always just dismal and disgusting. And we're seeing that through. And the same with the squad. I don't want to bash them too badly, but just if you have realistic expectations, you have to do what they do. But the podcasting, the other left podcasting, the big left podcasting, right? We're taking on big podcasts, big left podcasting. But the way they create these heroes out of people like AOC and the squad and Sanders and others.
In a sense, they're what the whatever we want to call them, the Democratic Socialist podcasts, little d, which I guess that's being generous. Is they're just replicating what the mainstream liberals are doing. Is like the mainstream liberals do it with Ginsburg and Feinstein and Hillary Clinton and whoever else, whereas the sort of Democratic Socialists do it with AOC and Bernie and
Cornel West now.
Yeah, Cornel West and various members of the squad actually are very popular with those folks. And I think you're right. Those folks are politically as good as we're going to get American political system these days. And I like some of their stuff they do and say, but it's still also I find them disappointing as well.
Yeah, I think Cornel West has been on so many issues, but at the same time, this campaign is taking oxygen away. Today he said he's not going to run with the Green Party now, right? So it becomes even more kind of curious. But, there's so much going on right now. You have unions organizing and going on strike. There was a terrifying, to me, story the other day in the Washington Post about healthcare in Ohio, public health in Ohio, which is the other place where I live. And it's just horrible. They lowered taxes on cigarettes. They don't enforce seatbelt laws, just basic, kind of simple public health ideas. And so the lifespans and the mortality rates in Ohio are way worse than they are in adjacent counties in Pennsylvania and New York, right? You could be dealing with that. You could be dealing with unions. You could be dealing with the environment. You could be doing the kind of stuff that you recently did in New York. And when, no, I'm just saying, instead of that, we're dealing with, will Cornel West get on the ballot? The reality is that he's not going to get on a lot of ballots. If he does run, he's not going to get a lot of votes. If by some bizarre chance he got a lot of votes and cost Biden the election, that would just make things worse for the left. And I have no interest in Biden or anything like that. I don't give a shit. But the reality is that there are so many things you could do other than putting these lefty icons on a pedestal. And I think Feinstein clearly reflected that, and we're seeing a lot of that today. So
hey, I do want to say one thing, talking about how we have this resurgent, emergent labor movement, which is pretty fantastic in so many ways. I'm very inspired by Sean Fain and Fran Drescher, just even as for leaders. Climate movement, also very similar things are going on. And actually this organizing space I've been in lately, which is around trade and militarism in the Pacific, those folks were doing this organizing work against the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, which we'll have more episodes on in the future. But there's like a fantastic grassroots space going on, which is not trying to get people elected. It's all local. It's all moving about against big international institutions or national institutions. And there's a lot of power out there. And then we get diverted by both mainstream liberals, the Democratic Socialist media sphere, and the Green sphere, whoever else, and where they should be just like focusing more on putting people into the street and organizing in communities versus in some electoral media space. Just wanted to say that one last thing.
Yeah, it's something we've talked about before, and we catch a lot of hell for it because the Cornel West people are just adamant that this is the best way to approach politics in 2023, running in for president.
I also want to give a shout out to all those people, because a lot of those folks are the people who listen to our podcast and send us messages and compliments and love listening to the stuff we talk about, and especially when we critique liberal institutions, whether it's the Sierra Club or whether it's Dianne Feinstein or whatever. So big shout out to all of our fans out there for that on that front too.
Yeah, that's really a battleground that we've never really taken into account. That's about the Republicans versus Democrats, liberals versus conservatives. I think that the determinant kind of conflict for a long time now has been liberals or moderates, whatever you want to call them, versus the left. And they've always punched. They're already doing it, right? They're already blaming Cornel West for losing. So the first thing they do is punch left. Yeah. And Feinstein clearly reflects that as well. Because
no self-reflection on running an 80-year-old guy for president, though, right?
I met somewhere. No, Feinstein just wants history taught the way it is when she was at Stanford in 1955.
Just the facts. Just the facts, Bob.
Just the facts.
Facts are funny things. Who said that? Who was it? Who said that?
Reagan said facts are stupid things. He said facts are stupid things.
Oh.
Right?
I thought he said funny things. I'm sorry. I misquoted.
No, it's even better. Facts are stupid things. I'm pretty sure that was Reagan. Yeah. Anyway, well, I wish we could be a little more upbeat, but it is what it is. Is all the kids say nowadays.
It's all going to be better when we have a new Speaker of the House. I'm sure.
It could be Jim Jordan.
It could be Jim Jordan, cover-up master of Ohio State wrestling sex scandal, or it could be Steve Scalise, who is David Duke without the baggage. But in my opinion, and I think Bob agrees with me on that, most of them are David Duke without the baggage, including like the likes of Dianne Feinstein. So
yeah, they did. I hear fly the Confederate flag at half staff for Feinstein when she died. So
yeah, there you go. All right, folks, we should bounce. You've been listening to the return of the scrappy sounds of your Scrappy Sunday from the Green and Red podcast. If you like what you're hearing, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Our Instagram game is super strong these days, and so give us lots of likes and lots of love there. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit subscribe. If you listen to us on any podcast platforms, go ahead and give us a rate and a review. It helps us with the algorithms. And if you really like what you're hearing, check us out on our website at greenredpodcast.org and hit that support button, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And we'll catch you all very later soon. Bye. Misbehave.
The landlord's here to visit. There's blasting disco down below. Says I'm doubling the rent cause my building's condemned. You're gonna help me buy City Hall. Oh, we can. You know we can. Oh, roaches up to my knees. Turn the oven on, it smells like that, yeah. Till the rain pours through the ceiling. But we can, you know we can. But we can, you know we can. Let's wish the landlord, let's wish the landlord.